Hello and welcome to another episode of Supply Chains Disrupted. In today's video, we'll focus our attention on supply chain trends in the context of business restructurings. And of course, this can take different forms from mergers and acquisitions, internal reorgs, divestments, just to name a few. What we've been seeing in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic is a lot of disruption to business models. And we talked about some of these key trends in our first episode. Factory closures, logistics issues, supply chain disruption, getting inventory to the market, just to name a few. However, this has also provided opportunities for new investments and has fueled M&A activity in the field across many sectors. And as part of the recovery, companies are really focusing on increasing supply chain agility, cost efficiencies, as well as sustainability and transparency, which is one of the key themes we'll touch on today. And to talk about these trends, I'm very pleased to be joined by two of my colleagues from the Global Reorgs Group. Joe Hewitt is a corporate reorgs partner based in our London team who specializes on post-acquisition integrations in the context of internal reorgs. Joe is also one of our in-house experts on supply chain sustainability and the topic of ESG, which we'll also touch upon later. And Joe focuses on the consumer goods and retail sector. And we also have Alistair Craig. Alistair is a tax partner, also based in London. And Alistair focuses on pre-deal and post-deal M&A activity in the context of tax and has experience across a wide array of industries. So, Joe, I want to turn to you first. Can you talk a little bit about our Global Reorgs Group and why is it so important to have a good understanding of the supply chain and the different trends when engaging in a global restructuring project?
Yeah, so you mentioned our Global Reorganizations Group. And when we conceived of that group some 2 decades ago now within Baker & McKenzie, we really felt that it was important to kind of bring together a multidisciplinary team. So not just corporate reorg specialists like myself, but also our tax team, employment team, those focused on regulatory issues. And one of the reasons that we felt that was important is that in any kind of reorganization, any business transformation, it's really important to be able to understand all of those different impacts, not just to think about things in a purely legal sense, but understand the full regulatory and tax impact too. But also for all of us to have a really concrete understanding of the nature of the organization's business, how it makes money, how the value chain works. Because that's going to be relevant to any planning of a reorganization, to deciding what the objectives of that reorganization should be, as well as how to make it work effectively. And just to give you one example, we see this very often in post-acquisition integration, which is one of our sort of mainstay projects in the reorganizations team. The supply chain analysis, understanding the supply chain, will really go to the heart of planning what you do on the integration project, which entity survives, where you've got overlapping entities. And it gets very complicated when you start trying to overlay a post-acquisition integration, a legal entity integration, with a supply chain restructuring, where you're bringing together two organizations that maybe have very different models. So having a really concrete understanding is absolutely crucial.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks for that example. Definitely, it's something that we come across often as part of these projects. Alistair, turning to you. So in your day-to-day, you're often at the table advising companies on tax aspects of major restructurings. What insights can you draw on key supply chain trends, and importantly, why is this relevant from a tax perspective?
I guess there's a few things to pick out. I guess really, probably the first thing I'd say is there's got to be a real focus on understanding where the value is generated. That's really the key question from both a business and a tax perspective. We work very closely with other disciplines to answer this question and really staying close to the business trends and strategy of the company. So understanding, for example, where is the valuable IP in the group and where are the real profit generating activities. Really deep understanding of these is key in terms of managing the tax position on any reorganization project where it affects the supply chain. I'd also say, digital transformation, investments in technology, changing the dynamics of traditional supply chains. In relation to, for example, sourcing, manufacturing and logistics, Companies are increasingly investing in smart processes and using data and analytics to optimize how they source inputs and bring products to market. Now, those processes themselves can be a valuable contributor to the supply chain, and therefore they can give rise to potential tax costs if, for example, they're moved around or they're changed as part of any supply chain restructuring project or changing a group's transfer pricing model. We do see traditional companies acquiring smaller technology players or investing in technology themselves. And this is really reshaping their value proposition and certainly disrupting the market and their own business model. And that leads to itself to interesting tax questions. What's the role of technology? And there's also legal and tax questions about the ownership of data and when data itself becomes a valuable intangible. And also tax can play a key role as part of the due diligence process in a deal, from flagging key risks to planning of the transaction structure right through to post-deal integration. At times, tax doesn't feature very prominently during the pre-deal process. That's always one thing to look out for. And really, from my perspective, I'd say for tax, having a seat at the table and ensuring that the tax value is captured or not lost, depending on whether you're on buy side or sell side in a deal, is particularly important.
Thanks, Alistair. And you really touched upon one of those key concepts that I'd like to come back to later, which is value and value proposition and tax being at the table of those discussions together with the business. Joe, turning back to you. So both you and I do a lot of work in the consumer goods and retail space. And one of the key trends we're seeing is the focus on sustainability and ESG. Can you tell us a little bit about that, what it means for companies and your experience with this topic?
Yeah, I mean, this has been one of the sort of mega trends over recent years, and it's just growing in importance, I think, this focus on ESG or environmental, social and governance matters. It's a hugely relevant topic today because, it's not just about what governments and regulators are focused on. It's really around, consumer expectations, workforce expectations. And one of the kind of key topics in this space is really supply chain and supply chain transparency. Fascinating to think, that it's really kind of forcing a change in the way that directors and senior executives have to think about their businesses, because they're needing to take responsibility not just for what goes on in their own organization, but actually right along the supply chain, which can be very difficult. But that focus on sort of transparency and diligence in your supply chain, that's only going to increase. So what we're seeing here is, some particular legislation, pointing up this focus. In the UK, we already have a requirement for directors to make clear the way that they are factoring in sort of wider stakeholder impacts in their decision making, and that includes around the supply chain. But also to make particular statements around modern slavery, for example, the diligence that they have done in their organisations and throughout their supply chain to understand the risks around slavery and forced labour and child labour. And, we're set to see this trend continue because the EU itself has sustainability concerns at the heart of its sort of green agenda. And their proposals, the EU's proposals on sustainable corporate governance, look likely to impose an explicit duty of care on directors around broader stakeholders, broader impact on the community, and will also is also likely to require mandatory supply chain due diligence. So not just reporting on what you do in your supply chain and how you diligence it, but actually substantive requirements to diligence it. So I think what that's all sort of pointing to really is the need for a really kind of clear framework within organisations for boards understanding their responsibilities, delegating that appropriately to the executive levels and throughout the functions, and ensuring that the supply chain transparency is at the heart of all of that decision making, and that the board maintains appropriate levels of oversight, because ultimately it will be the directors who are held accountable for what goes on.
Thanks, Joe, and it's a nice segue to my next question to you, Alistair. Joe talked a lot about sustainability, transparency, and governance, and how that's really impacting companies' processes. I think these are themes we're definitely seeing within the tax function as well. What we're also seeing is a lot of regulatory developments in international tax policy. So a bit of a crystal balling question. Looking into the future, how do you think these trends will kind of reshape the role of tax in the context of global restructurings and supply chain planning?
That's a great question. I do wish I had a crystal ball. So I mean, the international tax system is seeing the biggest changes in over 100 years. From rules that are reallocating profits of the world's largest companies through to rules setting a minimum global tax rate of 15% amongst the OECD countries. Now, those changes are due to come into force in many countries throughout 2023 and 2024. Mostly those changes are focused on ensuring an increased tax take for mobile assets such as IP and ensuring that digital businesses are paying tax where they do business. And tax reform in the US is also subject to ongoing discussions in Congress, but again is likely to result in significant changes if the reforms can pass through the US legislative process. Tax has always been an important part of any global restructuring or supply chain planning, and all of these changes I've just talked about will only mean that tax will continue to be really important, and arguably will become even more important. We see real risks of income being, for example, doubly taxed due to overlapping rules between countries or differences in interpretation or application of rules. And sometimes, achieving even just a tax neutral result in a timely fashion might not always be possible. In this particular context, I'd say that, corporate reorganizations or supply chain restructuring can create significant one-off gains, for example, moving IP between jurisdictions. And these types of transactions are often scrutinized closely by tax authorities. So all of this increased complexity and change means that tax really does need to be front and center in planning any significant supply chain project. And even if only to ensure that a group doesn't end up with an unexpectedly large tax bill.
Thanks, Alistair. Really telling examples. So maybe to wrap it up, first of all, thank you, Joe and Alistair, for sharing the insights from your perspectives. I guess for me, the theme of today's episode is really around understanding the key themes of supply chains and really taking a holistic view to a global restructuring. And anytime you're advising, whether be it corporate, employment, trade, regulatory, or tax issues, really staying close to the business, understanding the value proposition, and staying tuned to those key supply chain trends, I think is a vital part of success on these projects. I want to close it off with a special thanks to our audience for tuning into our third episode. As always, if you have questions or any feedback, reach out. We'd love to hear from you. And bye for now from us, and stay tuned to Supply Chains Disrupted.